Thank you for tuning in to the Bold Lines podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about how budgeting your emotions will improve your relationships. I will go ahead and let you know, this is one of my favorite things to teach clients. This isn't one of those deeper psychological concepts. It's something that people get pretty quickly. If you're a prospective client listening to this episode, this one's for free, okay? For everyone else listening, I will let you know this is an episode that I would encourage you to take home because you're going to need to pause it a few times through in order to fully understand the episode and find a way to apply it to your own life. So, what does it mean to budget your emotions? Immediately, people are going to think about money when I talk about budgeting. That's fine. That's one of the cornerstones of how to understand all of this. What we're going to be looking at is how much money or emotional energy you have available and what your costs are on an average day. There's a few things we're going to take into account. First, we're going to be checking in to see what different things cost in your life. We're also going to look at what debts you might be incurring, as well as ways that you can save. Now, yes, this is very much about money. Again, it's not about money, but it'll definitely help. As a side note, this might help some people with actual budgeting. But I digress. So, what does it look like to make an emotional budget? The biggest concept in all of this, we're talking about emotional energy. That is not necessarily time dependent. The amount of time I spend on a task doesn't always mean that I'm putting in a ton of emotions. I'll give you an easy example. Commuting in my car, let's say my job's 30 minutes away and it costs me an hour to get back and forth. That travel takes up time, but it might not be that emotionally taxing. Now, if you drive on the interstate or in a very congested city, that might cost you some emotional energy, but at least to understand the concept. This is the idea. Sometimes things take our time, but they don't always take our energy. So, what are things that require emotional investment or emotional injury? Some of these things can include a marriage or intimate relationship. It could include children. It could also include family members, both immediate and extended. It can also include the job that you're at. And it could include your mental health or other things you have to attend to. Okay, so those are some of the main ones that we see. If we're being honest in our emotional budget, though, that isn't always what we pay out to. There's two things that I would add on here. Whenever I make an emotional budget with a client, there are two categories that I believe are always present. Number one are useful hobbies, and two, pitfalls. Let me tell you what I mean by hobbies. Hobbies, at least the way that I'm defining them for this episode, aren't just things that you do to run away or be distant from family or friends. Hobbies should be things that when you give emotional energy and time to, they end up paying out to you in a positive way. So let's say, for instance, that I play guitar because I'm a musician. I might pay in some emotional energy because I have to get myself started, put everything in there. But if I engage in a healthy way, what I get out of it is more than what I put in. It's something that's a good hobby that has me feeling rejuvenated. Hobbies in this instance aren't things that you do that make you mad. They aren't things that make you completely frustrated, okay? The other thing I put on here was pitfalls. Now, pitfalls are incredibly important in the emotional budget because we all have them, but we don't always engage in them. So some pitfalls or some examples that we could use could include things like drinking too much or smoking or vaping. These also can include other unhealthy negative behaviors that we don't always like to talk about. But all of these pitfalls are negative, but we don't always do them. If anybody here is listening and wondering what a pitfall would be, it's usually the stuff that you don't tell a ton of people about. On the extreme end, it could be something like an affair or adultery or some sort of infidelity, okay? Other pitfalls could be maybe you get sucked into your phone or some sort of media where it spends a lot of time, but you don't gain anything from it. In fact, you might feel more stressed after because then you have less time to accomplish what you need to do. So all of these categories that I mentioned, marriage, intimate relationships, children, family, job, mental health, hobbies, and pitfalls, these are things that you could consider in your emotional budget. You can add things. You can also subtract things. Like, let's say you don't have kids. That shouldn't be a category. But for the most part, this is what most people use. Okay. The next step, once you've written all of these things down, is you start by how much money you have to spend for the day. The way that I usually work this out with clients is you have $100 on a good day, on your normal day where you feel the most energized. Mark that as $100. The second thing that I have clients do, and hopefully you'll be doing as well, is come up with a number that represents a bad day. Some people's good days are $100 and their bad days might be $80. They might be $60 or $50. Okay? Whatever that number is fine. Make sure you have both of those written down. The next thing that I'll have people do is write down how much each category costs you. So if you feel as if your marriage takes up $10, write that down. If you feel like it takes $30 or even $50, maybe there's some conflict in the relationship, write that down. Once you've identified the largest cost in your life, start using other categories as measurements against it. An easy example would be if someone has a high stress job, and let's say that's their $50 mark, and they say, all right, my marriage is about half stress compared to that. So then they write down $25, so on and so forth. Those two categories that I said sometimes apply, hobbies and pitfalls, you can give those numbers as well. For the hobbies, you'd obviously make it positive. It's usually not a huge number though. Those are those little bumps. Pitfalls are usually small-ish, but they can be really bad. They can be huge debtors depending on what your pitfall specifically is. Now that you've gotten all of the categories in front of you and you've assigned them a certain amount and how much they cost you, it's time to take a second and step back. When you add up all of those categories, how much do you get? Most of the time, when I work with clients, they add up all their costs and go, oh crap, all of this stuff costs me $120 a day, but on my good days, I only have $100. This is a big light bulb moment for a lot of clients that on their good days, they're in debt. On their bad days, they're very much in debt. Big thing to notice here. I'll give some examples of how I've worked some of these things out in my own life, but that'll come a little bit later. Once you've calculated all these, you added them all up, you can start to see how much you might need to cut back on. Just like any good budget, financial one that is, you need to live within your means. Otherwise, bad things happen. So the next thing I have clients do when they're in my office is look at each category. How much is needed and how much are you spending? One of the easy ones that people tackle here is their job or school. They can have a high level of emotional investment in something, with not a whole lot of payout. Now, should you care about your job in school? Yes, absolutely. However, many of my clients end up giving a ton of emotional energy that doesn't actually pay out to them. They're so invested in something that they're scared to, quote unquote, pay less. But eventually, with some time, a lot of clients realize if they care about their jobs less, if they care about their schooling less, they actually get the same grade. Am I saying you should detach from work? No, I'm not saying that. But the amount of emotional investment that you give to these things can be changed. An easy way to think about this: if a job were to fire you or you were to quit, how much would that job or employer stress out? It's likely not that much. Does it mean that you're not valuable? It just means that's the nature of a job. Something similar happens with school. If you get a bad grade, do you know what happens? Likely not a whole lot, unless it's you got a 0 or you plagiarized and you're kicked out. Completely different thing. But if you got an 85 as opposed to an 80, do you know who cares? Not really anyone. You see this a lot in college. Let's say that you get a 90 instead of a 95 in a class. Or let's even take it a step further. Let's say you get an 80 instead of a 95 in class. You know who doesn't care? Your employer. They don't care all that much. Usually, the only person that cares is the person in my office. And yes, getting good grades is a wonderful thing. But is it worth losing out on other things you would like to pay out to? This is a big sticking point for a lot of people and something that a lot of clients need a little bit of pushing to trust me on. But in a lot of cases, people are overpaying emotional energy into something that they simply don't have to. Another example, and something that I think a lot of people might overpay into, are the family or friend relationships that aren't all that healthy. A lot of times clients will come in saying, this relationship is really stressful. And we step back and look at it objectively and realize they're the only ones paying in. We have a two-party relationship that exists with a minimum amount of money per day, but they're the only one paying in and nothing's even squared away or paid out. And I simply ask them, how important is it to you? If you find it to be important, that's fine. Keep paying in. But if you've come to realize that you're the only one paying in and it's not changing and nothing feels different, you might feel better caring less, but keeping a specific dynamic. Here's another thing I will say. When we look at these categories, we need to see if there's any return at all. One of the big ways that people can pay in is if there's a specific hobby or idea that they're dedicated to, where they become super invested, and no matter how much they pay in, pretty much nothing comes out. It's a category we really need to look at. This does happen in family issues, and I talked a little bit about how one-way relationships happen, although I do want to give one little clarification. When it comes to the concept of children and emotional budgeting, you're always going to be paying in the negative. Some of that payout may come later on in life, but that's a category you shouldn't expect a ton of money in. Once people have evaluated all of these things, they've gone through every category, they've seen how much everything costs, and they're looking at what they can pay into or change, people have to start figuring out, what do they do with surplus or debt? Almost every single client, well, I take that back. I've never met a client who was ever in surplus when we started this exercise. Every single client that I've done this exercise with has always said, oh my goodness, I'm in debt, and I've been in debt for a very long time. Something to pay attention to. I have clients who come in overwhelmed, depressed, anxious. Not saying this is the sole cause of things like depression or anxiety. You can go back to further episodes if you need clarification, but in a lot of cases, people's depression and anxiety comes from emotional overspending. We're not allocating things where they need to be. So most people that I talk to, even outside of a therapy session, barely break even, if that. So let's figure out what to do with debt, because debt's an important thing to address. If every client I see is in debt, what does that mean? If we have better relationships, we'll feel better, sort of. But you have to pay attention to what you're paying in and see whether it's necessary or even normal. I'll give you an example, something that you might need to pay attention to. Let's say someone is paying in $50 a day to their marriage, but their spouse is only paying $20. Does that mean the spouse needs to kick it up? Maybe not. Maybe the client I have in front of me is overspending on their own anxiety. It has nothing to do with making the relationship better. It's just something they feel like they need to pay. So who should change, the client or the wife? Well, I don't know without context, but at least in this conversation, the client might be overpaying and stressing themselves out. Does that mean they care about their spouse less? No, it means they stop spending so much energy and time on evaluating a relationship that could be healthy. They might not need to do anything. I will say that in some of these other cases that I talked about, some of these other categories, people are bleeding emotional funds that are unnecessary. Easy examples, mental health. Sometimes people are bleeding funds into thinking about or treating mental health when it's not really needed. Sometimes paying in causes more debt. Other big things, trauma and trauma responses. That's the crazy thing about trauma is it'll bleed you dry. It's not always this one big chunk, but just over time, it slowly bleeds your funds out. The other thing that I'll say, some of the bleeding things are these relationships that you haven't evaluated. But no matter what kind of debt you have and where it's coming from, you and yourself have to pay off your debt. This debt can be paid off through time. It can be paid off through relationships or therapy. One thing that I will say about this, in good financial budgeting as well as emotional budgeting, you have to spend effectively. You have to have good payment plans. Let me give you some examples of good emotional budgeting that I've seen in my own life. There was a conference that I went to, and as a licensed therapist, you have to go to these types of conferences or trainings. About halfway through one of the days, I realized that I didn't have a ton of emotional energy left. And I thought to myself, wow, I have to go home to a wife and toddler that I love dearly. That part's required because I love them. This conference, though, I don't care that much about. Now, is that because the conference was bad? No, but in relation to my wife and my kid, I don't care all that much. So for the rest of that day, I wasn't emotionally invested, but my butt was in a chair getting credit. And do you know the only person that noticed? Me. I had the emotional energy going home when I saw my wife and my kid because guess what? I didn't overspend on something that didn't give me payout. And I realized if I don't have a whole lot left, I still have a whole lot of day left. Another thing that you can figure out how you want to handle is in those particularly romantic relationships. Are you paying in something that will always drain you? Or are you paying into a fund that your partner is as well? This is one of the great things that you can do about a surplus, something we haven't talked about yet. If you have the ability to pay into a relationship or a marriage where both parties are paying in and you're able to support one another, if there's a time down the road where one of you has to borrow money or can't pay in for the day, If you've built a surplus in your relationship account, guess what? It's not that big a deal if you have to work late over the weekend, or maybe your spouse has to go take care of something or is having a hard day and can't be as emotionally engaged. When you spend your emotional energy effectively, you can do those kinds of things. This can even be done to some degree with children. If you spend your money well, you spend your emotions well with your children, they will do things like forgive you and give you grace because you've already built an account with them. They know that even if you're having a hard day, there's stuff that's left over from days before. Some other things that you can do with the surplus. You could pay extra into meaningful relationships. Does that mean you're borrowing favors? No. If you do something nice for your spouse because you want to spend your emotions effectively and you're looking for an immediate payout, it's not paying in. That's cutting a deal. That's not how this works. You can cash out if needed in other areas. Let's say that there's friendships or there's groups that you're a part of. We're not always perfect. Sometimes we need to lean on one another. And if you've built a healthy account, it's not that big a deal if you need something or they need something. The other things that I'll say with a surplus is you should invest in yourself and growth. Sometimes we don't develop new skills or relationships because for some reason or another, we don't run a surplus at all. We don't give room in our emotional budget to accomplish anything. We overspend or we don't allocate funds well, and we just hemorrhage nonstop until things like addiction show up. Things like depression and anxiety show up, and people end up in my office going, why am I bankrupt? Why is it that I feel like I can't catch up? Like I'm always sinking. And in many ways, I end up as an emotional financial planner. All right. Where are you bleeding? What's going on? How can we cancel subscriptions? How can we work through all of these things? I get it. At the surface, this seems really, really odd, but it's quite true. So what do we take from all of this? Caring less about something doesn't mean that you stop caring at all. Sometimes caring less makes you more effective. You can't spend recklessly. Sure, you can have a credit card, but you know what happens? If you don't pay off that credit card, it affects your credit in the same way it affects your credit with the people around you. So if you're wondering, am I spending too much? Think to yourself, at the end of the day, do I feel a sense of hope or this will be over soon? I know in working in my PhD program, I ran a debt for a couple weeks. I prepared for it ahead of time, and I surely paid it off afterward because I didn't have a choice. But to anyone listening who thinks they might be interested in what this looks like, I would encourage you to play this episode over again. Walk through the steps. See where you're spending all of your money. See if you're spending it effectively. And start to be curious about what can shift. The cool thing is, for every client that I've done this with, they've been immediately able to make changes in their lives because they're open. And everybody loves a budget until it becomes difficult. So the last thing I'll say for anyone listening is, this is probably going to hurt. But if you want to get your life on balance and you want to be present for those that care about you, take the time to sit down and really evaluate where you're going. Thanks for listening today. I hope this episode was useful to you. I know talking about finances and emotions can be a difficult thing. If you found this useful enough, I hope that you follow the podcast, share it with people who might also find benefit. And if you feel the compulsion to, give as a tip to the podcast to help pay for the production. Thank you so much and have a great day.